This is lesson 27, which includes the hithpael verbal stem. We'll also include a bonus verbal stem, the hishtafel, as well as swearing in Hebrew. So let's get busy. You've had the hifel, kal, and piel, the active verbal stems, and you've also learned one passive verbal stem, the nifel, which normally corresponds to the kal. That is, verbs that are active in the kal, except for that oddball kal passive participle that doesn't belong. Verbs that are active in the kal will normally be passive in the nifel, although the nifel also has a reflexive sense that it uses as well, or reciprocal. But for the most part, the reflexive or reciprocal, that is reflexive if it's one person doing something to himself, and reciprocal if it's a group doing something to one another. This can be expressed in the nifel, but it's more straightforwardly and often expressed in the hithpael. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but let's take a look. You remember that nearly 70% of the verbs you meet are going to be kal. Solid nearly 13% will be hifel, just about 10% will be piel. You learned the nifel, call it 1 in 20, right, about 5%. And that takes us to the real skinny pieces of the pie. And here I am looking at you, hithpael, right there at the top of the screen with 1.6%. So it's not that they're not important, but the good news is you don't meet these very often. And what's more, you're going to find that they're pretty easy to spot. Let's look at the hithpael perfect of the strong verb, taking katal as our paradigmatic template. Go ahead and read through it with me. 3MS, hitkatael, hitkatala, hitkatalta, hitkatalt, hitkatalti. In the plural column, beginning with the 3CP, they have done thus and so. Hitkatalu, hitkataltem, hitkatalten, hitkatalnu. So what are the characteristic markers of the hithpael perfect? Well, there's the big hit that stands before the root. Nice big field mark there, and you can see the doubling of the second radical. The rest of the root falls into the basic katael pattern that we already know from the piel imperfect, right? Yukatel, tukatel, or in the perfect, it's kittail, kittala, kittalta, and so on. But here, hitkatel. Before we go on to the imperfect and so on of the hithpael, let's look briefly at the meaning so we can see what this verb stem is accomplishing. It will often have a reflexive meaning. This is probably the most common meaning. That is, the subject of the verb is also its object. He bathed himself, or whatever. Here we go. Hitkadashu. Hitkadashu. See, the root is kadash. They sanctified themselves. They made themselves holy. Iterative, right? Repeated activity, activity done over and over again, is one use of the hithpael. So, you know the root halak, obviously, to walk. Hit halek, to walk, to walk about. Reciprocal, you can see in the first example, they sanctified themselves. That's basically a group acting on itself, right? Here, reciprocal, mutual action or influence among members of a group. Hitra'u, It's not that the group looked at itself like in one great big mirror. The members of the group looked at one another. Hit ra'u. Obviously, resh aleph hey. These are the hithpa'el participles. No surprise that the participle is expressed is marked by a meme prefix. You'll remember the PL participle with meme schwa, mukatel, the hiphil participle with meme patak, meme a class vowel, maktil, maktil. The nifl participle was marked by a hey prefix, if you'll remember that odd hey prefix. Do I remember that correctly? Let's take a quick look. I feel like I'm not quite right there. Lesson 26. Yep, I'm wrong. Nifl participle. I forgot. It's the one that looks like the MS perfect, except for the comets. Nishmar. Nishmar. So the nifl was one that did not have a meme prefix in the participle. That's just the beginning of what's strange about the nifl. But here we're back to the meme prefixes. Mitkatel. Mitkatel. If you want to review the nifl participle and remember how it's not like the other ones, you might look at the synopsis of verbs in the nifl, which is on page 295 in your grammar. So mukatel, and then the usual participle suffixes that we know and love so well. Feminine singular, mitkatelet. Masculine plural, mitkatalim. Feminine plural, mitkatalot. Which brings us to the imperfect. And as we've seen in so many cases, the imperfect, the 3ms imperfect, is the same as the participle, just substituting the preformative of the imperfect for the meme. So the participle, masculine singular, mitkatel, swap out that meme for a yod, you get your third masculine singular imperfect, yitkatel. And the preformatives of the imperfect, completely predictable here. Yitkatel, titkatel, titkatel, titkatali, 2 FS there, and 1 CS, etkatel. They will do thus and so. Yitkatalu, titkatelna. Y'all will do thus and so. Titkatalu, titkatelna. We shall do thus and so. Nitkatel. Again, the it prefix coming after the preformative, just as in the perfect, it's a hit prefix. In the participle, it's a mit prefix. And in the imperfect, yit, tit, et, whatever the preformative is, right? Nit for the 1CS. Very straightforward, very straightforward. The imperative, hitkatel for the masculine singular. That is it's just the same as the third masculine singular perfect. But the rest of the pattern is of course not the same as the perfect. So masculine singular, do thus and so, hitkatel. Feminine singular, hitkatali. Masculine plural, hitkatalu. Feminine plural, hitkatelna. Oh, when I proved this one, I didn't see the rogue dageshes that shouldn't be in those hays in the plural forms. So ignore those. Those are not mapiks or anything else. They just shouldn't be there. And the infinitives, as we've seen in the derived stems already, for instance, the PL, where the imperative is katel, and the infinitive is also katel. Here we go with the infinitive hitkatel, infinitive construct, hitkatel, both of them the same as the masculine singular imperative hitkateo. In these derived stems that are rarely attested, you can really see the paradigm sort of leveling through. Everything is becoming the same as everything else in these relatively rare forms, the hithpael infinitive, the hithpael imperative, and such. So we can see that the hithpael stem is for the most part a dead giveaway. The infixed it, hit in the perfect, yit in the imperfect, mit in the participle. So you probably had that gut feeling that the bad news was coming next. Well, let's see where this stem becomes a wee bit more challenging. If the first radical in the root is a sibilant, like shin or sin or tsade or samek, that radical will trade places with the tav. When two consonants trade places, grammarians would call this metathesis. So for the participle hithpael form of root samek tav resh, to hide, we expect a form mitsater, mitsater. But the mouth finds it easier, instead of saying mits, to say mist, to put the sibilant first. And so people find themselves saying mistater, mistater, instead of mitsater, one who hides himself. Similarly, sakar, to hire someone, to make a hire, we would expect mitsaker, right? One who hires himself out. Mitsaker, but metathesis happens with the sibilant and the tav, and you get mistaker, mistaker. The key with these is to recognize that you have a hithpael participle with that mit thing going on, and realize that the where you expect mit, you're dealing with mis or mish before that tav comes along. Again, the second part of the form with the kat tail, right, with the tater and the taker, that's helping us a good bit. Similarly, in the imperfect, we expect yit shamer, he will guard himself, or he will be on his guard. But what we get is yishtamer, yishtamer. No difference in meaning, of course. It's just the way that people find themselves saying it is the way that it gets spelled. And then there's this tsade, right, which is also a sibilant, which is a little more aggressive. Not only is there metathesis, but the t sound in tsade, it's an emphatic sound. It's emphatic, grammatically speaking, linguistically speaking, and that causes the tav in the prefix mit or yit or hit. The tav in the hithpael prefix becomes emphatic itself. That is, it partially assimilates to the tsade. It takes on the tsade's emphatic quality. Let's see what that looks like. With the root tzadak, to be innocent or to be righteous, we would expect for the imperfect first common plural, nit tzadek, we will show ourselves innocent. Nit tzadek. Not only does it metathesize so that the tzade comes before the tav, but that tav becomes tet, taking on some of the emphatic quality of the tzade. Nitztadek. Nitztadek. Now, just so you remember, 1.6% of the verbs you meet in the field are hithpael and are generally easy to recognize. Of that 1.6% of verbs, Some small percentage of them are going to have initial sibilants, and some small percentage of those are going to be things like first sades like tzadak. So keep it in perspective. Mostly you'll recognize it by vocabulary anyway. At least once you've seen it once and been frustrated with it, then you'll recognize it by vocabulary from then on. And then there's the dentals. We've seen how the sibilants are a wee bit vexing. Let's look at what the dentals do in this form. Basically, it's the way that tav acts with different things. Just as tav is a little tricky with the sibilants in one way, it's a little tricky with the dentals in its own way. For radicals that are first dental, that is dentals that put your tongue on the back of your teeth, like d or tet or tav, the initial tav will assimilate into that radical. So for daber, which is first dental, it's first dalet, we expect mit daber, but we just wind up with the tav assimilating into the dalet. Midaber. Midaber. I hope you can see in this example that in the hypothetical first form, mit daber, the dagesh in the dalet is weak. Yes, it's not strong because it doesn't follow a vowel. It's just a begad kafat weak dagesh. But in the second example, it's a doubling dagesh, showing the assimilation of the tav. We can see it's a doubling dagesh because it follows a vowel. Midaber, one who is conversing, perhaps with himself or something. Similarly, with first tet, root taha, meaning to be pure. In the hithpael, hypothetical form, hit tahoru, they purified themselves. The tav assimilates into the tet, and we get hit taharu. You've got to see the doubling of the initial dental, and realize that what's being assimilated there is not a noon. Not a noon, but rather the tav of the hithpael. A fraction of the 1.6%. Another example, tamam, geminate root there, tav me meme, hitamam. Right, the tav of the prefix assimilating into the tav that is the first radical of the root. And then there's just those couple of guys that aren't initial sibilant and aren't first dental, but they just want to act like it. No rule here to learn, just being aware that there's a little sporadic assimilation going on here, especially with noon and kaf. So, root nun beit aleph, meaning to prophesy. Hypothetical form, hit naba'u, they prophesied, perhaps amongst themselves or something. Hit naba'u. And the tav assimilates of all things into the noon. Who would have seen it coming? Not me. Hin naba'u. Hin naba'u. They prophesied. Again, first kaf, root kaf samek he, means to conceal or to be concealed. Hit kaseh. He or it will be concealed, sort of a passive sense, maybe hide itself. And the tav assimilates into the kaf. Hikaseh. Or I'm sorry, tikaseh. It's a feminine singular here, see? So it's third person feminine singular. Tikaseh. It will be concealed or it will conceal itself. The assimilation of the tav into the kaf, it just slaps you right upside the head. Who's going to see it coming? Nobody. But now you know. Last thing to look at before we take a break. And the last impossible thing you need to swallow before you take a break. Speaking of the sibilant sisters, newsflash, the BDB accused of misidentifying an unrelated verbal root as a sibilant sister. That is, there's a root that is not sibilant, but when the BDB was written, they thought it was. Let's take a look. There is a root Chet vav hey. Chet vav hey only appears in the hishtafel pattern. That's right, not the hithpael, which is what you just learned. This is a bonus verb stem that you don't know yet. You're learning it now. It's only attested in one root, chet vav hey. And in turn, chet vav hey is only attested in the hishtafel verbal pattern. And I'll do you one better. There's only this word. In the hishtafel pattern, what we call the hishtafel pattern, which is a root with a prefix hishta, the root chet vav hey, means to worship or to bow down. Misters B, D, and B didn't know about this, and when they saw the word to worship or to bow down, they didn't know about the prefix hishta, and they thought the root was a hithpael of a first shin, shin chet hey. So if you want to, take a look in your BDB and look up the root shin chet hey. You'll find a word that means to bow down or to worship, and they treat it as a hithpael. Years after the BDB, we dug some interesting stuff up out of the ground, learned some things we didn't know before, and discovered that the root is really supposed to be chet vav hey, and that it's a verbal stem that those guys didn't know about, the hishtafel, which is how it appears in more recent grammars. Go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back. And when you come back, I'll teach you this word, this one word to worship and bow down that uses this verbal stem, and then we'll go on and learn about swearing, which I think by that time you will be ready to want to do.